Wanted to let you know that before we start recording. All right. So our meeting objectives today are to consult with all of you as chief elected officials on the proposed memorandum of understanding policy updates, as well as support and assistance needs related to local development of infrastructure funding agreements and one-stop operating budget. So we are really here to have a conversation with you to gather your feedback, your questions, your input. And I think it's really important to emphasize at the outset, just for context, that this is one of 4 consultation sessions that will be happening around the recommended policy updates to the existing MOU policy to incorporate guidance on IFAs. We had our first consultation session with the WIOA required partners. And today is our second consultation with you. The next consultation will be with the local boards. That is scheduled for March 23rd. And then we will be consulting with the state workforce board in April. So this is a really intentional and multi-month process to gather feedback from all of the really important stakeholders that need to weigh in on the proposed updates to incorporate IFA guidance. And so we just wanted to let you know that this is one of 4. We're really thrilled that you're here with us today. And really the window for gathering feedback on the core partners' recommended policy updates will run through April. So there is time after today to provide this feedback. So this really is part of a larger collaborative effort that the WIOA core partners have initiated to engage all the different partners at the state and local level to provide input into this policy and to set state level guidance that is consistent with federal requirements and really best positions local partners to develop IFAs that can support needs in their communities and with their constituents. So that is what we're hoping to achieve with you today. And we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So quick review of our agenda today. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we have set up the day here and our logistics. We would love to do introductions since we have a pretty big group. We're going to do that in chat today. And then I will be turning it over to Darcy and also to Wendy to talk a little bit more really in terms of setting the foundation for what WIOA requires around MOUs and IFAs. We'll talk about the work that Iowa has done to date in this area, so you have a little bit of a sense of the history of this work. And then we'll really spend a good amount of time going over the draft MOU policy recommendations, the updates to incorporate infrastructure funding agreements, and then we'll spend about 20 minutes or so getting your questions, your feedback, and having discussion before we wrap up and look ahead to what's coming next. Good morning, Liz. All right, so the way that we're going to structure this, as I said, we have blocked a good amount of time for discussion and feedback, but we really do want to hear your questions and comments throughout the course of the day. So please do put them in the chat as we go along today, and we will loop back with them. But we did want to share with you at the outset some of the questions that we want you to be thinking about as we move towards our discussion segment today. The first one being, what lessons have been learned from the MOU development process that we can bring into the work to ultimately develop infrastructure funding agreements at the local level? So lessons learned. Certainly, if you anticipate any particular challenges or concerns, we want to hear about those as we work to think about the policy updates and also the related technical assistance to address those. We want to hear how the state WIOA core partners can support you and your local partners ultimately in IFA development as we move into that phase. And we want to hear about whether there might be additional information needs in order to get that work done well. And certainly we also want to hear about technical assistance needs. We'll be sharing with you what's planned in terms of support for local partners on IFA development, but would love to hear about if you have additional needs or ways that you could be supported. We'd love to hear that feedback. So please keep those questions in mind as we go through the day, and we will circle back with those. So I see folks are starting to introduce themselves in the chat. Thank you, that's wonderful. We want you to do that. If you could all take a minute to let us know your name, the county you're representing, the local workforce development area that you're a partner with, And we would love to have a sense of how familiar you already are with WIOA MOUs and IFAs. And you can just put very or somewhat or not very in the chat. Just want to get a sense of sort of how people are coming to this conversation to make sure that we best meet your needs today. So we'll take just a minute for folks to introduce themselves in the chat. And welcome all. I'm really glad. I want to point out that we have some of our state core partners, part of the core partner working group here with us today. Obviously, you all have been instrumental in working on the draft policy updates. So thanks so much for being here. Okay. Well, continue to introduce yourselves and share your level of familiarity. We would love to hear that. And that will really help us tailor our conversation today. And again, we're really, really glad to have you all here. All right. So before we dig in, just in terms of context setting for the conversation today, as we think about memoranda of understanding and infrastructure funding agreements, you all as CEOs, as well as your local board partners, are going to have played and are going to play a number of different roles in this work. And certainly as CEOs at the local level, you will be participating in the development of MOUs and IFAs. For the purposes of these conversations, these consultations, and this is something that we shared in our first consultation and we'll continue to share moving forward, we're really asking folks to come to the conversation from a customer-focused, kind of systems-oriented perspective. So really thinking about what is the best way to develop IFA guidance to be added to the existing MOU guidance that can support local partners in developing a system that meets the needs of their communities and their constituents, and enables the system to work as well as possible. So while we know you all are going to have very specific roles moving forward in the actual development of the IFAs, we're asking you to come to this conversation to inform policy development, really with your kind of system architect hat on. So, we're really coming at this from a perspective of gathering as much feedback as possible, focusing on how best to support and continuously improve Iowa's workforce development system, and really coming together in a collaborative effort to think about the best ways to do this as we support updating the policy. So that's kind of the orientation that we're taking for this conversation, and just wanted to share that perspective with you today. And with that, unless there are any questions, I'll take a quick look at the chat. I think, Darcy, I'm going to be turning it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Gretchen, and good morning. And again, welcome to everyone. I know that we have varying levels of familiarity with the MOU and with the IFA, and we're all in the right place, because even those who may have worked with it before, it's not something you do every day as part of your day job. So we want to give a quick refresher just in terms of, from the federal law, what it is, what is required. We'll look at that Iowa context of what Iowa has done so far, and then zoom into those specific, the big policy changes and recommended updates. So I know we sent out our policy recommendation document in advance of today's meeting. We'll also ensure that you have this slide deck, and following up from this meeting, a draft of our supporting guide, one of the resources that we're developing for implementation. So if you're a person who needs to sleep on stuff or talk about stuff after you hear it, that's okay. You may just be listening today and you've got that feedback window to circle back with us with questions and comments as we move along. So that we're all starting from the same place, just looking at what the how MOUs and IFAs are defined, the relationship between the two, and what they're designed on. That's where we'll start. So the Memorandum of Understanding is an agreement between the chief lead elected official, your local workforce board, and each one-stop partner in your local area that outlines the operation of your one-stop delivery system. So it sets that vision and strategy for service delivery by identifying the role that each partner will play. The MOU should be answering the question of how will your local one-stop system provide services and how is it going to be funded? So thinking about just the MOU section, and we'll look at IFA next, it's almost like that blueprint for your system. Where are our customers going to receive services? How are they receiving those services? How are our partners delivering their program services in our local area? And then the infrastructure funding agreement is a component of the MOU that details the financial plan to fund the services and the operating costs of your one-stop delivery system. So you're designing your system, you're saying we're going to have 100 one-stop centers in our area. And now your partners are going to talk about it and say, okay, now we have to pay for 100 one-stop centers in our area, or however it is that you have designed it. And so again, it's the infrastructure funding agreement is a component of the MOU. I think it's important to think of those pieces together. And so this is not new work for the state of Iowa. You have MOUs in place that have really done the hardest part of the work of defining and describing your service delivery system approach. And now is the second piece of creating that financial plan to deliver and sustain that vision. And this is really the same order of operations that most states have followed in this implementation aspect. It was MOU first, followed by IFA. So just to give you some reassurance that you are doing things in the right order, and we'll talk about next the responsibilities in this process. So you may hear me emphasize this quite a few times. This is a locally driven process. So from a state policy perspective, really the state is ensuring that you are following the process, but the state is trying to be as little prescriptive as possible in telling you how to do it, because that is your decision at a local level among your partners as chief elected officials and with your local board. So the responsibilities are that your local workforce development board is responsible for negotiating and developing the memorandum of understanding, including the one-stop operating budget. Usually we see the board utilizing their staff to convene partners and complete this task. But as the one-stop partners locally, the chief elected officials who are signing the agreement, and you must be in agreement to sign the documents indicating that. There's one more piece from the law that I want to highlight, especially for you all, for local boards and chief elected official responsibilities. And it is specific to developing the piece of the MOU related to one-stop infrastructure funding. So there are 3 things outlined in the law that fall under local and CEO responsibilities. Number 1, ensuring that the one-stop partners adhere to the guidance on the one-stop delivery system infrastructure costs. That would be referencing your state and federal guidance. You also have the responsibility to work with your local one-stop partners to achieve consensus and informally mediate any conflicts or disagreements among them. So you're convening to reach that consensus and that agreement through your local negotiations. You also are providing technical assistance, in particular to new one-stop partners or local grant recipients, to ensure that they're informed and knowledgeable about the elements in the MOU and the one-stop infrastructure cost arrangement. So highlighting that for you, to be aware of that this is the process and there are different places along the way as this work is happening where you may be stepping in or just seeking updates to ensure that things are going smoothly. In terms of who must contribute, your MOUs and infrastructure funding agreements are developed at a center level. So the law has a couple of distinctions for cost contributions. At a comprehensive center, infrastructure costs are all required partners in that local area are required to support infrastructure costs, whether they are co-located or not. Additional shared costs that are not infrastructure costs are covered by only those required partners who have agreed to share in the costs of one or more career services or other shared services. If it is an affiliated or specialized center, Your infrastructure costs are paid by only those partners engaged in the given center. And the same thing with additional shared costs. It's the partners engaged in the center who agree to share in those costs of career services and other shared services. So just to know that it works a little bit differently in terms of requirements to contribute from the law. And as a refresher, though I'm sure you're pretty aware of this, your one-stop center types and definitions were developed through your center certification process guidance. So your comprehensive centers have titles 1 and 3 present full-time with one other core partner present at least part-time. Your affiliated centers are defined as having 2 or more core partners present with at least one core partner present on a full-time basis. And your satellite center is any location where one core or required partner is present on a permanent basis. However, titles 1 and 3 are not eligible to have standalone offices or be satellite centers. I want to touch quickly on the requirements for your state guidance.
Could you clarify what partners are? Please clarify partners, that term partner you're using.
Sure. I think, Gretchen, maybe you can add that into the chat, our core and required partners.
Sure thing, will do.
We'll put a list in there for you all. In terms of the requirements for this guidance that you're here to provide consultation on, the governor is required by the federal law to issue guidance around the infrastructure funding of the one-stop delivery system in consultation with chief elected officials, the state workforce board, and local workforce development boards. And I think as we're answering that partner question, partner participation in a center could be physically present, officed in and working out of a center. They may also be delivering their services through a direct linkage or virtually in a center. But we're going to get that list posted so you know who your partners in your local area might be. So what is required to be included in this guidance are 2 things: guidelines for determining program partner contributions and guidance to assist local boards, chief elected officials, and one-stop partners in determining equitable and stable methods of funding the costs. Both of these are based on what the law describes as proportionate use and relative benefit received. And I'm gonna pause here to see if we have questions on just what we're looking for in the law, and then we'll touch on Iowa's progress to date. Let me pass the virtual microphone to Wendy to share a little bit more about Iowa's work.
Great, thanks, Darcy. Hello again, everybody. I'm going to kind of run you through a brief timeline of how we got to where we are today and having these consultation sessions. So I know that Gretchen is working on putting the partners in the chat. And I just wanted to share a little bit more, as this work has really been done in partnership with the core partner programs, and wanted to share who that is in Iowa. So WIOA consists of core partners, which would be titles 1, title 1, which is adult dislocated worker and youth, title 2, which is adult education and literacy, title 3, which is Wagner Pizer employment services, and title 4, vocational rehabilitation services. So in Iowa, IWD, Iowa Workforce Development, administers Title 1 and Title 3. Title 2, Adult Education and Literacy, is administered by the Iowa Department of Education. Title 4 is jointly administered by Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation Services and Iowa Department for the Blind. So we have core partners at the state level that come together weekly to talk about some of these policy pieces and develop some of these standards we've been talking about, policies, and processes. So those partners I just mentioned came together and developed policy specific to the Memorandum of Understanding. And that was published in January of 2021. That's all in accordance with WIOA Section 121. We also put out additional guidance on the Iowa State Workforce Development Board website regarding information for those local boards. If you're familiar with that website, you click on LWDB information, and that's where you'll find all of the information that we put out. We released a MOU template and guidance in March of 2021. And we also held a Q&A session in April of 2021 after that template and guidance had been provided out. One-stop center certification, which I know local areas are currently working on that now. We worked on the guidance for that between 2021 and 2022, which was quite the lift for the core partners, but we did get that guidance out and provided training in June of 2022 with local stakeholders. I also wanted to share out that all of this kind of came to because, well, number one, it's required in the law, but number two, the Department of Labor had provided within their monitoring to us, really starting in 2017, a couple different findings related specifically to MOUs. It focused at that time really on required partners not being a party to the MOU, and we really needed to kind of get that in place. So that's really where a lot of this work started. More recently, we have continued to receive findings in our U.S. Department of Labor monitoring in relation to MOUs and IFA compliance. We are not compliant in Iowa, and our partners have not really entered into negotiation on sharing of those costs. The Department of Labor has been very honest with us that we will continue receiving findings in each one of our monitorings until this is fixed. So we are excited to be entering into this partnership with you all and providing information and really trying to help make sure that all of our MOUs and IFAs are in place and compliant, so that we can continue to better serve Iowans. Do any of my core partners have any other feedback that they'd like to share? Okay, if not, I'll kind of continue going through this roadmap that's on the screen now. So when we look at IFA, the core partners that I mentioned had really started coming together September through October of 2022 to start developing a process for guidance. In December, we actually finalized IFA policy recommendations and some supporting resources that went along with it. Right now, February through March of this year, we are doing those consultation sessions, which I know was shared at the beginning of this session. We've already completed the required partner session. Today, we are doing the sessions for CLEOs and CEOs, as well as some of our board executive directors. At the end of the month, we will do a session specifically with local board staff and board members, and then we will also do a consultation with the State Workforce Development Board. We are very hopeful that in June of this year, we will have updated policy guidance that will be issued by the State Workforce Development Board. And then this summer, in July, really providing some additional technical assistance and supporting resources. And our target implementation date for IFA is coherent with the PY24 funds, which are released July. PY24 starts July 1st of 2024. So that's when we're really hoping to have those IFAs implemented and in place. Darcy, I think I'll kick it back over to you if there's nothing more on that section.
That's good. I saw a great question come through in the chat from Lisa about just kind of the reason for core partners maybe holding back from participating in this. And I'll invite core partners to add to what I think. I mean, I think in Peace there was a state policy opportunity to clarify and offer more guidance in terms of the process and expectations for this component of the MOU. I don't know if there were other considerations from core partners that you all would want to add. I will invite you all to do that, even continuing questions or comments in the chat as we go along. I'm keeping my eye on the clock and hoping not to cut into too much of your discussion time, but I'm going to need to tell you about some of the big changes so that you're able to have something to discuss. So pulled out from the document we sent ahead of this are the biggest types of changes in terms of your MOU policy update. Recommendations are falling into 3 buckets. So one is around your development of MOUs, one is around change, and one is around expectations for negotiation. And I think we've posted into the chat your current MOU policy that's in the document language we described, and I'll be sharing some of that language here on these slides too. So whatever way is helpful for you to see those pieces in context. But looking at the local process for developing one-stop operating budgets and infrastructure funding agreements first. So on these slides, when you're seeing any blue italicized text, that's the recommended language to add to your current policy. Whatever is just there and not blue, not italicized or bold text is already part of your current policy. So in terms of infrastructure funding and other cost sharing agreements, we saw in those federal guidance requirements having examples of cost allocation methodologies. So that's what's been added here. And these are the most common ways to allocate costs that we've seen in other states. So you can base it on the number of customers served. You count how many people are coming through your center and what services they're receiving, and divide that proportionally across the programs they're being served by. You can use square footage used. So how many within your one-stop center, what amount of square footage is being occupied by which partner, and allocate costs in that way. Or similar to that, the number of full-time equivalent staff that a partner has in that center. So those are just examples of cost allocation methodologies that are commonly used in infrastructure agreements. So those examples are added to the policy. Of course, at a local level, you would be determining which cost allocation methodology in negotiation with your partners is appropriate for your center. The second change under the category of developing your one-stop operating budget and infrastructure funding agreement. So this list from your current MOU policy is what must be included in that agreement. So the period of time it's effective, steps that you're using to reach consensus, a description of the process to resolve issues. In your current policy, this list is split out into 2 separate pieces, one for infrastructure funding agreements and one for other cost sharing agreements. The items on the list are the same, so it's now one list for infrastructure funding and other cost sharing agreements.
Hey,
Move
Darcy.
back a slide and talk about the bottom more. Sure. So this piece is part of your current MOU policy, and this is reflective of the federal requirements for your partners to share and jointly fund an infrastructure costs. So one-stop partners are required by law to use a portion of their funds to pay the additional costs related to the operation of the one-stop delivery system. And so infrastructure costs are where that requirement is. There are a couple of other types of costs described as shared services or career service costs, and they're allocated according to the benefit received by the partner and consistent with the laws under their program.
Can I ask, does that mean then, would that be administrative costs like for the one-stop operator? Is that for the board support staff? Is that part of what's authorized costs, I guess, or other costs that would be applicable?
It can be. So rather than defining those types of costs in your state policy, we do have those outlined with a lot of supporting examples in the guide that will be issued with this policy to share out. So I think the best way to look for that information and even follow up with questions will be in that guide resource, which I'll be able to show you in a bit. It's got key terms and definitions and follows the federal definitions of what types of things are considered in those different cost buckets. I do know we also have some of our core partner fiscal friends here if they have a fancier answer than me in terms of that cost piece, and I think, so those are they're not really like life-changing. Those are the big things in terms of what's been added or changed to your policy under the category of development. I want to make sure we have time to talk about the change bucket because there are some big changes there to just share with you all and to make sure you understand in terms of how you're changing your memorandum of understanding. So as of right now, your current policy, the only term officially defined in the policy is what's a substantial change. And it's defined on the left-hand side in your current policy as more than 5 to 10% deviation of any allocation percentages within the infrastructure funding agreement. So for example, you budget $100 for snow removal of a parking lot, it comes in at $400. That would be an example of a substantial change. The challenge here is that because you have both large, medium, and small partners in your system, a 5 to 10% financial change can have extremely different impacts on a partner's budget. In addition, there are other types of changes that could happen that might not fall into like a accountable percentage type of thing. So for example, if you have a brand new partner moving into your one-stop center, well, that's a new program or partner who can participate in sharing costs. And that could have a substantial impact on your other partners who now may not have to pay as much in your center. Or in the opposite, if you have a partner leave your center, they're no longer paying for those costs they've agreed to share, then your MOU would have to be changed or renegotiated to account for that. So the recommended update here is to remove this prescriptive or specific definition of substantial change. And as I noted, this and other key terms in the conversations about MOUs and IFAs are all outlined in the supporting guide, but it's not necessary for a policy definition here. And I want to talk next about reconciliation. So it is a requirement of the federal law that your MOU must be periodically reconciled. In your current policy, it gets a little bit confusing on talking about an amendment requires an amendment to one piece, like the IFA does not require an amendment to the MOU. It's kind of splitting and parsing them out in a way that's a little bit confusing or complicated, and when signatures are required, when signatures are not required, talking about reviewing things for statistical fluctuations. So to clear that up, to streamline and simplify it, there must be a process for periodic review and reconciliation, but from the state perspective, in state policy, that is a locally developed process. The process must exist, but deciding what that process is, how it goes about, that happens at the local level in the development of your MOU and infrastructure funding agreement. So to replace the language on the left in your current policy, the recommended update is that your one-stop operating budget must be periodically reconciled against actual costs incurred and adjusted accordingly. As part of the MOU development process, local areas have to develop that periodic review and reconciliation process for the one-stop operating budget against actual costs incurred. Best practice that we see for that is monthly or quarterly. If you're like, if it's a day that has the number 3 in it, we are reconciling our IFA and our budget, have fun. You know, you will get to choose and you'll be able to develop that in consideration of the capacity and pieces like that too. So the budget then must be adjusted according through an amendment, modification, or renewal, which I'll talk about what those 3 are, how they work next. And then local areas will ensure that a current MOU is submitted to IWD for their permanent file when changes are made. Just keeping them updated as you're changing your key documentation, they're getting a copy of that. I want to talk through what the change process looks like, and I'm going to do that through a visual first and then show you the supporting policy language that reflects this piece. So to change your MOU, on the left-hand side, you see examples of 3 potential triggers. So it could be that periodic reconciliation that we just talked about. Again, you're realizing that you budgeted a certain amount for maybe cleaning and sanitizing your center, and you know, a global pandemic happens and those costs really skyrocket and are not what you budgeted them to be, something like that. It could be in your annual review of your MOU and you're just saying, we thought we needed this, and you know, these things have changed in terms of our service design or delivery and our budget at our center. Your policy mentions also having that a signatory of the MOU may request a change. And so I'm going to talk about these 3 types of change from the bottom back up to the top. So again, if it's in the category of a substantial change where renegotiation will be required among all partners, then the MOU is going to follow a renewal process, which would require all parties to review and agree to all elements of the MOU. You're re-signing it and you're notifying IWD. This is your biggest type of change. An amendment is a smaller type of change. So the purpose of an amendment would be for adding, deleting, editing terms and provisions that are probably improving the contract on behalf of the parties, but they're also changing the spirit of the agreement. So this may be when a new partner is added or things like that. Again, things are working the same way, but this is still a pretty big change. So it is an amendment. All parties will review and agree to the parts of the MOU that have changed and then re-sign. And a modification is a change that does not alter the overall meaning or substance of the provisions in the agreement. So parties are reviewing and agreeing to that, but you're not having to recollect new signatures on the MOU. I want to share, so the language here, this is all new language proposed to be added to your policy to define and describe those 3 types of changes and the processes that they follow that I just showed you using that graphic. And going ahead, let's see. So modification and amendment, you had a small section on that in your current policy. Again, this language should match what I've described or how it works, but you're saying that annual review, periodic reconciliation might result in identifying changes to be made. And as you're developing that process for modification and review, the local board partners, you could also at a local level name, you know, if this happens, automatically for our area, it will be an amendment. So I'm trying to think of a circumstance where that would happen that wouldn't normally follow that, but you could name specific things if if a partner is starting to serve, well, I mean, in the case of a pandemic or something like that, if you're adding security or cleaning costs or things like that, it might trigger you to amend your infrastructure funding agreement to negotiate how those costs could be shared. So I can think of, for example, in Oklahoma, for a short time, there were added security needs at some of our one-stop centers. So that caused the need to have that conversation about sharing those costs among partners. And And again, your MOU is ensuring that all partners are receiving notice of the changes, having an opportunity to comment, receiving those in a timely manner as established in your local process for periodic modification. And on the MOU renewal, again, this language is matching the definitions of those 3 types of change. And at the annual review, the MOU may be changed through one of those 3 processes: modification, amendment, or renewal. The very last thing that I want to speak to is in terms of negotiations. So one of those local board and chief elected official responsibilities we saw at the beginning is to ensure that these negotiations go smoothly and consensus is reached. So the federal law offers an opportunity where if the local board reaches an impasse in infrastructure funding agreements, so this is under what's called the local funding mechanism, where you have the maximum amount of flexibility to do all of these things at the local level. There's also a state funding mechanism that can be triggered, and that is the equivalent of going nuclear. Under the state funding mechanism, as outlined in the federal law, the governor would then take the responsibility and the role of determining the cost contributions of every single partner. It is the least flexible option, it is least beneficial to your partners, and it is the furthest away from local control. So there are a couple of strategies or tools in place to support you all in preserving your local funding mechanism to avoid this scenario. So number 1, you have your state core partner team. If they're not already participating in your negotiations and you're hearing that there are impasses coming up or challenges in your negotiation, please bring your state partners into the conversation to support you in that. The second thing that is added is at the request of your Department of Labor Region 5 office, they would also like to be brought in to support local negotiations before a state funding mechanism scenario is triggered. And then, you know, if there's an impasse, then the local board notifies the governor, and there's a process outlined in your state plan, also in the federal law. It's pretty, there's not a lot of wiggle room or a place to change that process regarding the timeline for notification, the materials provided to the governor, the timeline for the governor to make that decision, and the appeals process. So I didn't include all of these pieces as slides here. They're described in that policy document and align with your state plan and align with federal law in the scenario that the state funding mechanism is triggered. I know we're getting questions coming in, and the very last thing I want to tell you is that we're not going to leave you with a policy as substantial as this and work that is as important as this without any resources to help you and your local areas and your partners implement and carry out this work. So when your MOU policy was previously released, you had about a 15-page supporting template and guidance to know step-by-step what's the timeline we should be following, what should we be doing along the way. There was a Q&A session and I think a recording. All of those things are still available on your state board website for the MOU component, and those resources are largely unchanged. We've just enhanced them to now include the additional support piece for your infrastructure funding agreement. So we've also added an Excel spreadsheet of a one-stop operating budget workbook template. So it's the spreadsheet where you could plug in your costs and budget amounts to develop that piece. And we're working on a recorded training session as well. So this guide, if you have familiarity with it from before with MOUs, has now changed from 15 pages to about 50 pages. And this is where those key definitions are living, step by step, what to go through for each step of the way in going from your MOU all the way to infrastructure funding agreement and having all of those pieces together. We are sharing out our draft of this document after this meeting. Again, our focus for consultation is that policy piece, but wanted you to know that your feedback can also inform changes that we can make to make these tools better and more useful to you all. And we have in the slide deck just kind of what that step-by-step cost sharing framework is. That's detailed in the guide, and I don't want to take any more of your question or discussion time, as I know a few things have come through the chat. But thanks for listening, and we're excited to get feedback from you all today and even after today's meeting.
Great. Thank you, Darcy. No, that's a lot of information that we covered. And as Darcy just said, you'll have an opportunity to continue to take a look at this and provide feedback over the course of this month and leading into April. So we have been getting some great questions in the chat, and I appreciate your patience. We wanted to make sure that we could cover everything that we felt like was important to share with you from an information perspective. But we have been tracking these questions. So I'm going to roll back up, and I apologize. I was typing some things in the chat when a couple of these questions came in. So I was looking at something else at the time, but let's just roll back up to the start and make sure that we can cover all of these questions as best as possible. So let me see here. Okay. So I think Don Seams, if you're still with us, I think Liz actually clarified the question that you shared earlier on around how if you have up to 17 required partners, it is a lengthy list of required partners. Does that mean you have to have 17 people in the one-stop center? And Liz did share in the chat, and I welcome Darcy, Wendy, and others to chime in here as well. No, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to have 17 people physically in a center. There are different ways that we as program partners can provide services in centers, and that may be physically, that may be through training partner staff to provide their services or access to their services, or it may be a direct linkage, which is typically like a technology linkage. So this isn't necessarily the requirement that you've got 17 or however many people representing all those partners physically in every single center. Darcy, is there anything that you would add to that, or Wendy or others that you would add to that?
The only thing I would add, Gretchen, and I was typing it for the chat, but your local area may not have all required partners present or serving in your area. So for example, Job Corps is a required partner, but they may not be providing services in every county of your state. They may be in certain parts of the state. So that's something where you may not be working with all 17 partners.
Great point. Okay. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit. Oh, good. Was somebody going to chime in? Okay. So one of the questions here, and I don't know that I'm best equipped to answer this one from a subject matter perspective, so I will kick it to my colleagues. Again, from Don, thinking about the number of partners, couldn't this potentially look like a huge financial burden, with building costs, salary costs, technology requirements, other costs? And I wanted to make sure that we get a chance to think about that. I don't know, Darcy, if you want to share some thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question I saw was, is there money left to provide actual services? Yeah. And I think that's the value of the work that you've already done in your MOU in designing your approach to service delivery. And I mean, and honestly, bringing as many of your partners to the table engaged in your local area as possible. So again, it's very different for one program to be absorbing 50 or 75% of the cost of these types of administrative things. And yes, in that scenario, what money is left for providing services? Now, each of your programs have federal requirements or limitations for administrative dollars versus program dollars and things like that. But I think really the better that you can define your vision, bring your partners to the table at that local level to engage in how we're providing services to our customers and creatively share these costs. Ultimately, that result is a better system experience for individuals coming to your center. So they're able to walk in the door and receive services and benefit from running water or a parking lot or a sign or things like these to come and have their needs met. And on the other side of the curtain, behind the scenes, your partners have collaborated in sharing these costs in a way. So your customer doesn't need to know that, this program pays for 20% of the light bill and this program is paying for the internet connection and that computer was bought by this program. Those pieces aren't important to your customer. They just need their needs met.
Thanks.
And I did note, and just to note, I think there was a question I saw pretty early on in the meeting about the risk to individual counties. That's a question I want to take with me to do a little bit of research on. I haven't thought about it in that way. I've only looked at it through the lens of an entire local area. So that's my homework from today, to take that question with me. Krista has asked in the chat, will we provide a name and list of those identified as the individuals who are negotiating on behalf of the partners?
Mhm.
Yes. Our recommendation has been to include an attachment to the policy that has the list for each program and point of contact for that role, for that program.
And I think the only thing that I would add to that, it's a great question, Krista, is that as we've been as the core partners have been working together and then in conversations with required partners, we've also tried to reinforce that's a really important role at the state level to provide that kind of information so that you all locally know who to go to and can have these conversations.
I saw one other really great question in the chat about the tension of maybe state-driven versus local control, and the change in that part. And to me, it comes back to like the slide we shared about when you're that state negotiator or local or state policy developer, local negotiator. There's a part of it that's changing hats here, because I guess interesting is the best word I can think about to label it this way. In some cases, depending on the structure of your partner organization, it is your state level partner participating in this local negotiation process, because they may not have regional managers, or they just may not have that organizational chart where there's a local person matched to every local area, and also to conduct in these fiscal negotiations, and or the person that has the information or access or authority to commit to those types of budgetary things. And I just want to know, I think that's, I mean, in terms of why the changes now, in the context of Iowa, we've done the work with getting the MOUs developed, but that infrastructure funding piece is out of compliance with the Department of Labor. And so that was the piece that brought the core partners together. I think we mentioned this, but we also included the fiscal decision makers with our core partners in developing these recommendations and resources. And I would invite, I don't know if Wendy or other core partner members want to add more to now versus not now about this change.
Yeah, I can kind of weigh in on that. And I guess in my standpoint, I don't think that it has changed. I think we're just kind of bringing it more to light from those findings from the Department of Labor. This is, what needs to happen per the law. The local areas had always been responsible for the MOU and IFA. It's just, it was not quite in compliance. And so that's why we're making sure we have policy and guidance available to make sure those things kind of stack up and get to compliance. But, I think that it has always been our position that the MOU, IFA is always locally driven, but to Darcy's point, some of those partners are still state level partners that do have to be a party to the MOU because of how some of the programs are structured.
This is Jim Irwin, and that is my question. And I'm just going to say I'm very frustrated with how every time we open up a new email from Workforce Development, when it comes to the WIOA process, they are, I shouldn't say every time, many times backpedaling or changing what is now our responsibility, or how we were doing something before is not legit. Even though we may have asked the question, this issue came up 2 years ago when we were dealing with temperature control in a building. We really looked into the the infrastructure funding agreement, and then we really realized that we should have more say. For example, in my opinion, it should have been us. It should have been the local workforce development boards that made the decision whether we're going to keep the Iowa Work Centers open during COVID or not. And that was a huge pushback from Director Townsend, that absolutely not. That is her decision and her decision only. And that is not right. And that is my issue with Director Townsend. She is absolutely wrong on most of these occasions on these items. She relies on Michelle McNerney to do everything. She will not take responsibility for any decisions that she makes.
We can take that.
This, what you're rolling out today,
Jim, we can take that conversation offline if you'd like, but the MOU IFA process, like we've trained so far, that is a party to the local boards and how that should be structured. But the remaining things that you would like to chat about regarding what you've said so far, we could take that offline out of this particular meeting. Thank you.
you have 34 counties that are backing out of this system because of these issues.
So I think, Jim, we do need to move on, because I know we just have a moment, and I apologize, because we just want to let you know real quick about next steps and ways to provide feedback as we move forward. Liz, I want to just really quick touch on your question, and probably Wendy, we can follow up on this one as well in terms of local fund allocation and the formula for that. I think we could follow up on that question as well. Because there is some reason to how funds are allocated, including those formulas. So just want to talk a little bit about next steps for those of you who can hang on for a minute or two. So in terms of the updated policy and the supporting resources, we will continue to work through consultation to get input and refine and finalize the updated policy for state board review and approval in June of 2023. And then, as Darcy also mentioned, we'll continue work to finalize the combined guide that is the kind of companion support to the policy, and welcome your feedback on that. So as you think about this after this meeting, as we share the draft guide out with you, we would welcome your feedback at WIOA@iwd.iowa.gov. And as I mentioned before, we have 2 additional consultation sessions, one with the boards coming up in a couple of weeks, and one with the state board that has yet to be scheduled, but will take place in April. And then real quickly here on the next slide, in terms of, I think what we're hoping to get from you, really, your main next step will be to digest this a little bit more, share questions, and provide feedback. So that's really the critical role for CEOs in terms of continuing to inform this work moving forward. We did want to share with you, however, over the course of this work and the consultations to date, and we'll continue to share this message, there are ways in which additional partners at the state and local level can support local areas in getting ready for this. And so this is something state partners are working on, and that we've encouraged other partners to work on as well. There's information, to an earlier question, that partners can provide that will be needed for completion of one-stop operating budgets and IFAs. So thinking about how partners can provide that information that you all might need at the local level to do these, that's something that partners are thinking about. And those are these costs that we've talked about that are shared, right? Outreach materials for a whole center, or dues that multiple partners might be benefiting from, or internet costs for a building. So these are things that, information pieces that partners are working on gathering to help support that local process. And we've also just encouraged partners to ensure that staff are knowledgeable about this, that they're empowered to make decisions, and that staff that'll be participating in these local negotiations and agreement developments are well prepared in order to do that. So I think we just wanted to share with you a little bit about, how we've been trying to position everybody to get ready for this and what they can be thinking about now, even in advance of the policy coming out. And then let us move on to the next slide. I'll take a quick look at the chat. I know, let's see here, a number of things just came in. Okay, thanks, Darcy, for answering those questions that just came up in the chat. I know we are a couple of minutes past time. As Darcy said, we have really tried to pack a lot of information we know into our time together today. And I just want to emphasize in wrapping up, I think this is one part of the conversation. It's not the end of the conversation. So we will be sharing the slides and the draft guide for your review that you can take a look at in addition to the piece that was already shared with you in advance. And feedback really is welcomed. That's why this consultation process is so intentional and taking place over the course of a couple of months. So I just want to thank you all for your time and your good questions today. We really appreciate you being here. And then I don't know, Wendy, if there's anything else that you want to say before we wrap up, but otherwise, just thanks for letting us be with you today.
No, I mean, the last thing I just want to say is, we appreciate the comments and the conversation, and, apologize that we're not able to provide more time right at this moment to engage in additional conversation, but my contact information is up on the screen. Please reach out anytime you have a question, a comment, want to chat about anything. You can reach out to me directly, and I think a lot of you also have other contacts with IWD. Please reach out, and we'd be happy to have continued conversations with you all. So with that, Gretchen, I think that we can conclude today's meeting. Thanks again, everybody, for being with us today. And it sounds like we'll be having some communication and conversation. So have a really great Thursday, and we will talk to you all again.
Thanks. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone.